Bosses think they've done a bang-up job of letting employees know about return to work. Employees don't agree. We'll tell you all about it in this episode of For Immediate Release. Another fine podcast from the FIR Podcast Network.
This is For Immediate Release, the podcast for communicators.
Welcome, everybody, to episode number 223 of For Immediate Release. I'm Shel Holtz.
And I'm Neville Hobson. Today we're going to talk about a return to work and declining trust amongst employees. But before that, we have an update on the Hermès copyright story we talked about in the previous episode.
So we do have this great story that came out of LinkedIn about the declining levels of trust that employees have in their employers as they work to bring people back to the office as we hope the COVID infection rates decline. But do want to bring everybody up to speed on a development in the Hermès story that we reported on in episode number 222. And you may recall that this was a story about an artist who had created NFTs that he'd placed on the OpenSea NFT marketplace that were essentially digital knockoffs of Hermès Birkin handbags. And Hermès sent a cease and desist letter, and he responded by proclaiming that he had First Amendment rights and that Hermès should be part of a bigger movement and let him express himself through his art. Well, those NFTs are gone from the OpenSea marketplace. They have just been removed. We don't know whether the artist removed them or OpenSea removed them, but all of that highfalutin talk about an artistic movement and evolution to something bigger than trademark protection seems to have been fairly hollow in the end, because he is not able to sell those NFTs. There's just placeholder gray boxes where they used to be, and some text that says something like "no longer available."
Yeah, things move fast in this world.
They do. Let that be a cautionary tale, though, to anybody else who thinks that they can do a knockoff of somebody else's trademark and sell it as an NFT. Well, let's talk about return to work. By the way, my company is bringing us back effective February 14th. Happy Valentine's Day. Get to the office. We will be mostly in a hybrid mode, but I saw this item in LinkedIn, published by one of the LinkedIn editors. I think it was last week. That says confidence among workers in their company's ability to call them back safely to offices has fallen to just over half, according to Morning Consult's latest weekly poll. That's the lowest level in the year since the survey began. Distrust is growing as employees brace for the latest in a series of return to office plans. Even remote work is posing a credibility gap. A separate survey shows that while 3 out of 4 bosses believe they are being transparent about work-from-home policies, fewer than half of workers agree. Communication may also be part of the disconnect on returning to the office. And it concludes by noting that a Gartner survey shows 42% of companies said nothing about the Supreme Court ruling that blocked a federal vaccination mandate for companies that employed over 100 workers. And I found this perplexing because we have been hearing since COVID began that the stock of internal communicators has risen. Companies have relied on them more. I know that as news emerges about COVID that would be relevant for our employees, I take that to our leaders and I say, we have to communicate something about this, and they agree, and we do. Sometimes they get to me before I can do that. They've heard it first and recognize the need to communicate. But what is going on here where companies are just failing to communicate all of a sudden?
It is a failure of communication, isn't it? I think I don't see, I mean, this is a picture in the US. I don't know what the picture is here, if it's similar or not. I've seen little reporting on this as any kind of issue. Omicron has kind of thrown a spanner in the works, as we say here, in terms of momentum for employees returning to offices. That was picking up in November, December, here in the UK and in some other European countries, as governments encouraged people to do that. Then Omicron struck. That, according to some data that Google's published actually on the community mobility data sets that they've made public, it shows a huge spike drop in people returning to work at around about December time, when this became apparent that Omicron was a big problem over here. I think that's had an impact, and there hasn't been any consequent credible communication, it seems. And in fact, I think that's been overshadowed by the miscommunication, meaning, I don't mean disinformation, but miscommunication by government, certainly here, that has added to more confusion. And so people have just not gone into the office. But tied with that, as you said, Shell, if there's a vacuum for communication in the office, i.e. by the employer, what's an employee to do? If they're able to decide themselves, I'm not going to go in there, that's what's been happening, right?
I think it has, but I think a lot of companies have been in this position where they've been setting a date for the return to the office. Then we have the virus continuing to surge, where the experts had been saying, well, it should be fine by this date, and it's not. And then they have to push the date back, and it's led to a lot of confusion. And I think there are certain companies where the executives are throwing up their hands and saying, when we're ready to come back, we'll tell people we're not going to set a date, or we've set a date, but it may move again, so we're not going to communicate, real strongly about this.
Maybe it is that. I think there's credibility in that likelihood. Some big companies, some large employers, notably in the financial services industry, have gone very public with their delays and rescheduling returns, which has provoked, certainly in London, the local press in London, which have big circulations, to comment on, why are you confusing your employees even more? And then you hear anecdotal stories, and these are people commenting on places like LinkedIn, and Facebook, and not so much Twitter, on the cack-handed way the communication is being handled when there is communication. It's almost the carrot and the stick, with a stick very visible, which is, you better come back to the office when we say. And that's provoking people to say, what, you don't care about whether it's safe or not? And that's public discussion happening like that. That can't be doing anyone any good, that kind of thing. And it feeds on, I think, the worries and concerns of people. But whichever way you look at it, in terms of what is the reason, who's not doing what, who is doing what, it's a very confusing picture, it seems to me.
It is. And in that LinkedIn piece, the part that concerns me the most is the survey that found that 3 out of 4 bosses believe they're being transparent about their work from home policies, but fewer than half of employees agree. This is a situation that calls for over communication. And I also wonder if on the boss side, there are certain assumptions that have not necessarily been tested. Have you surveyed your employees to find out whether they're ready to come back? And if they're not, what their concerns are? I mean, there may be many who are concerned about whether it's safe, are concerned about contracting the virus, either on transportation to and from the office or at the office. They haven't heard adequate information about what safety precautions the company is taking. They're not altogether sure what the policy is. It needs to be over-communicated.
Yeah, I doubt that's going to happen, Sheldon, really. I'm saying, I'm reminded of surveys that were published in the summer last year into the autumn by the likes of the World Economic Forum, Harvard Business Review, some really credible publications that researched the picture and talked about the fact that employers seem to be in some different planet somewhere in why they're not involving employees in the planning of a return to work policy. And you heard comments being quoted in some of these reports of people in organizations in leadership roles, not necessarily the CEO level, just saying basically, well, we don't need to talk to them. We'll just tell them when things are going back to normal again. And I think
that'll boost engagement, won't it?
That attitude is probably still alive and well, or unwell, in too many organizations. But we're really talking about mostly large organizations doing this. I think the pictures may not be so dissimilar even in small businesses, it's just got less numbers. And so it's still, though, I mean, I look at, again, this is anecdotal. I think of people I know who are either not going back to the office or who are going back to the office. Of the ones who are going back, I would judge roughly 50% of them are not happy at all with having to do that. So again, as we know, as we talked before, this is for office people we're talking. There's some jobs where you can't have that choice. But the hybrid, so it's kind of reverting back to, okay, fine, people, as you were, work from home, continue doing work from home until you hear otherwise. The longer that goes on like that, the less likely, I think, people are going to be to want to go back to the office anyway.
And there are companies, I think there are some in the financial services industry as well as in the tech industry that have said, look, you want to work from home, work from home. You've demonstrated that productivity actually goes up, certainly doesn't suffer. We're going to offer full-time remote to those kinds of jobs that where they can work.
Right.
And I don't know if you saw this. I posted this on LinkedIn. It was a share of a cartoon that it says working at the top. And it's two pie charts. And on the left, it says at the office. And it's divided into sitting in traffic, getting lunch, getting coffee, chatting with coworkers, and working. And on the right, it says at home, and it's just working. And a lot of people love that. I have to read to you, though, what Steve Crescenzo wrote when he shared this. He says, as someone who worked at home for most of my career, that home pie chart should also include dealing with children, dealing with spouses, dealing with pets, dealing with neighbors or friends who don't work, so they assume you don't either, since you're at home and pop in or call all the time, making lunch for kids, making dinner for kids, shopping for lunches and dinners for kids, helping kids with homework, temptation to sleep in, temptation to keep working through the dinner hour and piss off other family members, temptation to move happy hour up to 3 p.m., dealing with IT issues because you are the IT department, family who call during work hours because you're not really working, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this panacea that working from home is great is not necessarily the case. I know of people who can't wait to get back to work, and they're not among leadership, but they still aren't getting the messages they need from the company about what's happening.
Well, this is a big topic. You can be sure we'll discuss this in the monthly show coming up and see what's changed. If you, dear listeners, have any experiences you'd like to share with us, well, send them in.
And that will be a 30 for this episode of For Immediate Release.